Amtrak has a number of long distance lines. Some people believe that these lines should be cut. Others believe that there should be more long distance lines in the Amtrak network. I've read both perspectives in the comment section of my videos, so it's time for me to take a side on this issue. Before taking a side on this issue, I should probably explain what a long distance route is to begin with. They are the routes in the Amtrak network that are 750 miles or more in length. But there are a couple of other things that make long distance routes distinct from their shorter distance counterparts. First, their funding. These routes get their funding from the federal government rather than state governments. And second, the passenger experience. The passenger experience on long distance routes is also different from other routes, and that almost all long distance routes involve at least one night on the train if you travel the route's entire distance. Let's return to the funding piece, as funding is at the center of the debate over Amtrak's long distance lines, and whether they should even exist, let alone be expanded. Here's why. These long distance routes are heavily subsidized by the federal government. The reason they are subsidized by the federal government is that the long distance routes lose money. A lot of money. In fiscal year 2023, Amtrak operated long distance lines at a loss of nearly $600 million. The only way these long distance routes are able to keep operating at a substantial loss is due to federal subsidies. And because of this substantial loss, there are some who advocate for addressing this issue by Amtrak simply cutting the lines that lose the most money. I can see why one would be led to advocate for this. However, before concluding whether that is the solution Amtrak should pursue, I think it would be helpful to look at why these long distance routes lose so much money, who would benefit from cutting these long distance lines, and who would be hurt by cutting long distance lines. By looking at these factors, we can start to form a conclusion on how to proceed. To start taking a deep dive into this question, I went directly to the horse's mouth. In my research, I found an Amtrak white paper from several years ago, looking at how long-distance trains perform financially. The white paper is not a perfect source, because it uses numbers from fiscal year 2018. That indicates that the white paper was published before the pandemic. But at the same time, Amtrak has reported that ridership has actually surpassed pre-pandemic levels, telling me that there are some useful nuggets from the white paper. One nugget that is as true now as it was in the late 2010s white paper is that Amtrak makes less revenue per seat mile with long-distance trains than its other services. Consider this. 26% of Amtrak's total revenues come from long-distance trains, according to the Eno Center for Transportation. And that's while long-distance trains account for 38% of Amtrak's train miles. The revenues are not proportional with the train miles. It explains a reason for some of the losses. Another factor the white paper cited is labor costs. To highlight this, the white paper showed that the California Zephyr service, which is a long-distance line, needs 45 employees per one-way trip. On the other hand, the Northeast Corridor trains only need 5 employees per round trip. A third factor the white paper cited is equipment costs. The paper points out that the long-distance trains require more train cars and locomotives than shorter distance ones. And some of these train cars are ones that have no ticketed service, such as the baggage car and the lounge car. It's a basic math equation. You need to run more equipment on long-distance lines than shorter distance ones. And at the same time, there's less equipment available for ticketed revenue on longer distance service than their shorter distance counterparts. That equals fewer opportunities to make money. Looking at this white paper provided me with an introduction as to why long-distance trains lose money. However, I feel that there are additional reasons for the poor financial performance of long-distance trains. For example, The white paper only briefly mentioned the fact that these long distance trains get no subsidies from states. The shorter distance lines that aren't the Northeast Corridor, also known as state supported routes, get subsidies from states, and these states cover most of the operating losses of said lines. These losses were only $91 million in 2018 with state subsidies. Without state subsidies, Amtrak would have been operating these state supported lines at a loss of $325 million in fiscal year 2018, compared to about $543 million for long distance lines. That doesn't cover nearly the entire gap in financial performance between the state supported routes and the long distance lines, but the gap between state supported and long distance lines is not as wide as it might appear upon first glance. Another factor to mention is service delays caused by freight rail companies. Delays that disproportionately impact long distance trains. Amtrak owns almost none of its tracks, and runs almost exclusively on tracks owned by freight rail companies such as BNSF, Union Pacific, and Norfolk Southern. These trains are often delayed due to this thing called freight rail interferences, through which Amtrak trains get delayed due to freight rail making themselves a priority on their own tracks. Doing this is technically illegal, but some of these freight companies do it anyway. If this didn't happen, Amtrak estimated a few years ago that they would experience a one-time cost savings of $336 million and an annual savings of $41.9 million. That money is probably a little more now when adjusted for inflation. But I'd venture to guess that a large chunk of those savings would help the bottom lines of the long distance routes, because the worst performing lines from an on-time percentage standpoint are the long distance routes. What this means is that I'm guessing that they have a lot to gain from a financial savings standpoint if Amtrak trains were able to operate reliably and without interferences from freight rail companies. And if these long distance services operate reliably, my guess is that more people would be willing to take long distance trains. I mean, if there is a mode of transport you can't trust to take you from point A to point B in a timely manner, then you're less likely to take it. That is precisely the problem Amtrak's long distance service currently has. So without these stupid freight interferences, you'd probably have more people willing to take Amtrak trains. As to how much of an impact that would have on revenue for Amtrak's long distance services, it's hard to say, but it probably would have some impact. These are all reasons that Amtrak's long distance services lose so much money. But before concluding whether Amtrak should cut its long distance lines, maintain them as they are, or increase the number of long distance lines, I think we should see who would benefit from cutting these lines and who would be hurt. Because without considering the impact such a move would have on people, I feel like there's something missing from this conversation. I have to say that I originally wasn't sure who would benefit, but this website called Downsizing the Federal Government, which is a project of the Cato Institute, a conservative think tank, argues that closing down the lines that lose the most money would result in dedicating more resources to the higher demand routes, so that service can be improved on said routes. I personally am skeptical as to whether the Cato Institute is right. But if they did happen to be correct, the beneficiaries would be people who use routes like the Northeast Corridor between Washington, D.C. and Boston, or the Pacific Surfliner in California, which connects some of the major metro areas in Southern California. The people who would be hurt by eliminating long-distance lines are the people in places that currently exclusively have long-distance Amtrak service. Consider this. The three long-distance lines that lose the most money are the Southwest Chief, the California Zephyr, and the Empire Builder. If we cut these three routes, something the Cato Institute would probably advocate for, here are some cities that would end up without any Amtrak service at all whatsoever. Topeka, Kansas, Albuquerque, New Mexico, Flagstaff, Arizona, San Bernardino, California, Fargo, North Dakota, Spokane, Washington, Reno, Nevada, Salt Lake City, Utah, Grand Junction, Colorado, Omaha, Nebraska, Lincoln, Nebraska, and perhaps, most notably, Denver, Colorado. Amtrak's network already has more holes than Swiss cheese, packing passenger service to places like Las Vegas, Nevada, Tulsa, Oklahoma, Columbus, Ohio, and Louisville, Kentucky. For all that this downsizing the federal government website cited the United Kingdom as an example of the path the US should follow with Amtrak, taking an approach that would remove a city the size of Fargo from its network, let alone a city like Denver, would be unfathomable in the United Kingdom. Cutting Denver from the Amtrak network would be like the United Kingdom cutting Manchester from their network. And if you think that sounds ridiculous, the city of Denver is larger than the city of Manchester, and the Denver metro area has a population similar to the Manchester metro area. Outside of these cities, there are rural parts of America that are nowhere close to an airport, and the only options for long-distance travel are either driving or Amtrak. Taking away Amtrak would take away one of those options. I think of a place like Trinidad, Colorado, which is nearly 100 miles away from an airport in Pueblo. But they have an Amtrak station, which gives the residents another option for long-distance travel. So I've rambled on for quite some time already about why these long-distance routes lose a lot of money, as well as who would benefit or would be hurt by the cutting of these routes. But I still haven't answered the question this video is meant to address. Should Amtrak cut its long-distance lines? Before answering that question, I just want to remind people to smash the like button and subscribe to my channel for more content on imagining better rail transit in the United States. Okay, now I should actually answer the question of whether Amtrak should cut its long-distance lines. I've kept you all in suspense long enough. My answer is absolutely not, and here's why. Many of the causes of Amtrak losing so much money on its long-distance routes are systemic issues that wouldn't be fixed by cutting the most unprofitable of routes. It's stuff like the lack of state subsidies minimizing the losses, the delays from freight interferences and how they cost Amtrak money, and the delays from freight interferences and how they limit the number of people who want to take Amtrak. Without these factors in play, I'm not sure if the long-distance routes would be performing that much worse than the state-supported routes. They probably would still perform worse than the state-supported routes, but the financial performance gap between these two types of routes would be a lot narrower than they are currently. The big thing for me, though, is realizing the number of people who would be hurt and who would lose access to Amtrak service if we simply did away with these long-distance lines. Earlier, I mentioned the places that would lose service if we eliminated the three most unprofitable long-distance lines. However, if we eliminated all long-distance service, consequences would be even more catastrophic for train service in the United States. Metro areas like Phoenix, Houston, San Antonio, and Jacksonville, 4 of America's 10 largest cities, would be without Amtrak. Let's gloss over the fact that it is debatable, at best, as to whether the Phoenix area even has Amtrak to begin with. But that's the subject of its own video, probably. To use a UK metaphor, since the Cato Institute seems to love how the United Kingdom does rail, it would be like cutting rail transport from Nottingham, Sheffield, Glasgow, and Leeds. Something that I think even the Cato Institute would concede would be absolutely absurd. Or I hope they would concede that fact. Yes, it means Amtrak would continue to lose money and be subsidized by the federal government. But as a taxpayer myself, providing another form of transit to millions of Americans is something I'm happy to see taxpayer dollars go to, especially at a time when air travel is stressful and driving on the road is also stressful and involves a lot of traffic. However, I'm going to make perhaps a shocking take for a pro rail YouTube channel. I would not recommend a frenzy of adding longer distance routes. And that is for two reasons. First, because long distance routes are so unreliable. And second, because longer distance trains generally run once a day or less. Because of these factors, I think that the best way to serve the largest number of Amtrak customers is by focusing on shorter distance routes as much as possible. If longer distance routes became more reliable, though, and or they became more frequent, I'd be willing to change my tune. That said, I do think long distance routes provide a car-free alternative to road tripping across the country. So I would recommend adding long distance Amtrak service in cases and places where there could be demand for that alternative to road tripping. I'd also recommend long distance routes in places where states are reluctant to fund state supported routes. While long distance routes are not ideal in that they only run to their destinations only once a day in most cases and frequently late, it's better than no service at all. I'd be curious to hear if there are any other arguments for or against the long distance Amtrak lines. If you think my takes are good, I'd like to hear it. If you think my takes are bad, I'd also like to hear a perspective different from mine. Please let me know in the comment section below. Also, stay tuned. For next week's video, we'll outline some rough drafts of ideas for how to help Amtrak's long distance services encounter fewer delays. Because while I do think that we should keep long distance services, there is a lot of room for improvement.